in.
Okay.
So I will try to troubleshoot that and see if we can get them.
Perfect. That sounds good. Yeah. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I know it's been a quick turnaround. It seems like we just met a day ago, but that's kind of how life is right now. Everything's running together, but certainly appreciate everybody making time out for this. It's really incredibly important, and I know it's important to everyone on this call and in this meeting. So thank you for jumping on. As Carol said, I think most of you are on here. Director Smith just jumped on. It's Happy Katie Beckett Day. It was a year ago today that CMS approved the Katie Beckett waiver in Tennessee. Which is something I think for all of us to be able to celebrate. So again, thank you to everyone that participated in making that come to a reality here in Tennessee. And we're certainly excited about what that's doing for families and what it's going to do for families in the future. I think this is kind of a natural extension of that is talking about education and some of the things that Representative Whitson and others in the legislature need to hear from us and from stakeholders and from parents. So that being said, Ginger, if you want to pull up the preamble, I know we try to read that, and I'll turn that over to you and let you kind of guide us through that, and then we'll jump back into the roll call.
Can you all see my screen?
We can.
Excellent. Okay, the Tennessee Department of Education is excited to work with you on this opportunity to discuss the state's formula for funding public education. Before we begin, the department would like to remind you of the following. Conversations on this topic are not intended to reflect on the current BEP funding formula. The current BEP funding formula will remain in place until a new funding formula is recommended to and approved by the Tennessee General Assembly. The public is encouraged to submit comments in writing to ensure that all communications are thoroughly documented and can be reviewed and considered in the future. Public comment is encouraged to focus on developing a new funding formula rather than revising the current funding formula. Consider what should be funded in a new funding formula and at what level. Subcommittees will be responsible for reviewing public comment and making recommendations for what should be included in a new funding formula. While all committees, subcommittees, and members of the public should feel free to communicate openly, documents, records will be subject to public inspection pursuant to the Tennessee Public Records Act and may be publicly posted or otherwise made available. All recommendations that are submitted by committees and subcommittees will be reviewed and considered, but not all recommendations will ultimately be included in the proposed new funding formula.
Thank you, Ginger. And actually, I think you might have a roster. I know there are some folks that are just dialed in, so I can't call them off by name. Would you mind going down your list if you've got the roster in front of you?
I do.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Carol Westlake.
I'm present.
Lori Smith. Stephen Smith.
I am here.
Sandra Edwards.
I am here.
David Martin.
Present.
Lynette Porter.
Present.
Jennifer Apria.
I'm here.
Leanne Simmerman.
I'm here.
Mandy Fisher.
I'm here.
Ann Thornstein.
She just sent an email to ask somebody to let her in.
Okay. I will send her a new link in just 1 second. Wendy Tucker.
I'm here.
Senator Powers.
I'm here.
And Representative Whitson.
I'm here.
Excellent.
Perfect. And I just saw Anna's email. Thank you for pointing that out. We'll certainly let Ginger try to make sure that she can access the meeting. So we'll go ahead and move forward, Ginger. Thanks for pulling that up on that slide. So just a few friendly reminders here that we had talked about. I think most folks on here are aware of all of this, maximizing our experience on the committee. You should have received some information in the meeting invite relative to the agenda and other pieces of information for our meetings and the meeting that we had 2 weeks ago. We want to make sure that we have a lot of time in between to really do some digging. Representative Whitson, I think I heard you when I jumped on here talking about feedback from families and other stakeholders that might not have had the opportunity to be present. We certainly want to make sure that we're giving ample time for committee members to be able to share that back with Ginger. In fact, Ginger and I met I think it was last week, Ginger, before last Friday, just to talk about feedback and how we want to make sure we're capturing that and kind of the expectations as we're moving forward. And really, it was interesting, and I cannot remember who it was, and I apologize. One of the emerging themes that I received feedback from was around gifted students and funding for gifted students that historically might not have looked a certain way, or just making sure that there's an understanding as we're talking about students with disabilities, that we're also talking about students that are exceptional learners in a gifted program and making sure that their needs are going to be met. So I thought that was pretty unique that was the feedback I got, not as much from the disability side as I did from the gifted side. So I want to stop just for a second and maybe open it up just for 5 or 10 minutes to see if there's any other feedback that any committee members received that's important for Ginger to be able to document and make sure that we're capturing all of the thoughts and all the perspectives. Anybody want to open up? If you want to raise your hand, it's probably easier for me to see it on the screen and I can call you. But I'd love to hear some feedback if you took it to stakeholders. And I see a hand up, and it's David Martin. David.
Hi. So one of the things that I've been reaching out to fellow directors of schools to get some information on them. And I think one of the things that we're going to need to look at around special education is the ratios for staffing to students.
Okay.
And I don't have those numbers in front of me right this second, but one of the concerns has been staffing with students and the ratios, specifically things like the school psychologist side. And that was brought up during one of the first town hall meeting as well, the ratio with the school psychologist and the recommendations from the national organization versus what we actually have, and then what the numbers are actually looking like out in the districts. And then one of the other concerns, and this actually affects me as well, is the paraprofessionals and educational assistants, those as teacher assistants in the classrooms,
Mm-hmm.
and the ratio there, and just the base pay for those folks, especially right now, since we're experiencing this great resignation that's going on, and it's difficult for districts, and it's difficult for my school when McDonald's is offering $15 an hour in daily pay. To compete with some of that sometimes with getting those educational assistants in the classroom, because they're very important parts of the equation in making sure that our students' needs are met, and many of the IEPs dictate those services within the IEP, and it's very difficult sometimes for districts to meet those. So I think that we have to look at that in the funding formula, as well as how we're funding those support positions, and then just the ratios, because I think the ratios are way too high to effectively serve the students based on those state-based ratios.
I saw a lot of heads nodding, David, in agreement with you. So really appreciate that feedback there as well, because I think that's an important part of it. Leanne, I think you raised your hand.
I did, thank you. I was just going to follow up what he said, because I'd done some research. So I have those ratios. Option 1, 91 students per single teacher. Options 2 and 3, 58.5. Options 4, 5, and 6, 16.5. And then options 7, 8, 9, and 10, 8.5. There's not a teacher on the planet that can handle a caseload of 91 kids and adequately meet their needs. So I just wanted to throw that out there as just a support, as what he was saying. Those ratios are a must-have when we're looking at revamping things.
And for those folks that don't understand what she was just saying, as far as what that means is that's by service time for the kids. So if a kid receives 0 to 1 hour of service time, then that's where those categories fall in. And so those upper echelons, those like 91 to 1 ratios would be things like your speech language pathologist and those folks. And then the further you go down, that is a more restrictive environment for that student. But like she said, the ratios are just really sort of wonky. Like it's really even if you're a speech language pathologist, to keep up with 91 students on a caseload, if you think about there's a yearly IEP meeting for each one of those students, at least one. And for them to be in those IEP meetings, plus doing the service times and the paperwork and everything else that's involved, it's impossible. So we really have to look at those ratios as part of this. Thank you for providing those ratios. I have the same information. I think I left it in the car. So.
Yeah, that was great. Leanne, thank you for that, because I think anytime we put data behind the conversation, that helps drive home the point, when numbers are involved. So appreciate you bringing that up. Any other areas of feedback that you might have received in between our last meeting and this meeting relative to BEP or any other points of concern? Hey, Carol.
Hey there. Just talking to a number of families who kind of reached out. One of the issues that they were really talking about is making sure that we're thinking about adequate school nurses as we go forward. I think the pandemic has kind of taught us a little bit about health, obviously, but both for students with disabilities and frankly for those without. I mean, having an adequate school nurse population is really important. It's especially important, I think, to a number of folks in the TBI community. That's sort of the leading cause of acquired disability in children, especially, and having school nurses available on staff is pretty important.
Good feedback, Carol. Thank you. Mandy, I think you raised your hand. Hey, go ahead, Representative Whitson. I'm sorry. You can go, and then Mandy, and then Leanne can chime in too.
Oh, I was just going to follow up what Carol was saying. Right now, the BEP currently funds 1 nurse for every 3,000 students in a school population. And we are working on some legislation, myself and Mark White tried to reduce that in the current BEP. I know that's not the issue of discussion here, but that's what we're looking at right now is 1 to 3,000 is what's currently being funded. I just want to add that.
Sure. Thank you. Mandy.
Yes, some of the feedback that I received were coming from parents in counties where gifted education was not provided at the elementary level. I think that, it's really important that we make sure that we have staff available at all levels that are trained for those students that have that intellectual need. I feel like from what I'm hearing is, some counties start at the elementary level and go all the way through to the high school level with dual enrollment. Again, we've got some counties that don't even have those opportunities for those intellectually gifted students. So I think just making sure that we look at all areas at all levels for these students.
It's a good point, and I'm wondering, Ginger, I don't know if you'd have access to that data, but I'm wondering how many counties that actually impacts, and not just counties, but actual school districts that might be independent, city schools. Do you know, Mandy, or was that just feedback, was just concerned about it, but not really sure what the data was?
That is only just feedback. I do not actually have the data across the state on what counties actually practice at all 3 levels, elementary, middle, and high school.
Ginger, that might be something we take away if there's ways for us to pull data down around gifted programs or working with the superintendent, however you guys need to do it. I don't want to dictate it, but that might be helpful to know and really drive that home, Mandy, around 35% of our schools don't have gifted programs after, or before 8th grade. I don't know what the number might be, but you get my point about the data would tell that story. So really, really good point. Leanne?
Thanks. I will piggyback on that. Ginger, if you will reach out to Nancy Williams at the State Department, she was the former coordinator of gifted services. She pulled all that data probably 2.5 years ago, maybe. So it's what she has is a little out of date, so it need to be updated, but she had a hard time pulling because of the definitions of services that are out there, and people not wanting to, like she said, not serve in earlier grades or push out at later grades. So she's got all of that. The last thing I wanted to put in there that I've gotten a lot of feedback is endorsements and requiring endorsements to teach the children that are being taught so that they're not, and right now we know there's this teacher shortage, but like gifted endorsements especially, you've got districts that have no endorsed gifted educators in the entire district. And that is a requirement, but they're not out there. But as I was talking about this, there are issues with every disability area. There aren't enough vision specialists, hearing impaired specialists. So those kinds of things, just making sure that the endorsement requirements are there, but we also have some sort of supports, recruitment, training to make sure we've got the people to do that. So something about training and endorsements and just making sure our kids are being educated by people who are qualified to do that.
Ginger, one thing that I want to add to that too, that I think I think there'll be agreement here. It was brought up to me, and I just remember that after you were just saying that, Leanne, was there's no longer a gifted leader in the State Department of Education. There historically was. Several people reached out to me and said that they felt like strategically that was a mistake for us not to have one. Maybe an opportunity to review the hierarchy or the additional consideration again of moving back to whatever that structure might have been that acknowledged leadership for gifted students. So Leanne, I'm glad you said that. We'll go to Wendy and then we'll go to Jennifer. Wendy.
Thank you. I just wanted to add on the gifted conversation. Under the current formula, I think we all recognize students are given the money there's a certain amount per student and those dollars wind up feeding special ed. If we are moving towards a student-based funding system, then in the gifted space, it's going to matter that a student has an IEP. Different districts are handling gifted in different ways. Some districts refuse to give IEPs, some you push and they'll give them. Some districts have all kids with gifted with IEPs. So I don't know if that's separate legislation that needs to be thought about, but if you're tying dollars to gifted and you don't have IEPs in that district, it's going to be a really hard thing to do just sort of functionally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good feedback. Thank you. Jennifer?
Yeah, I wanted to jump off of what Leanne was talking about with the endorsements. I know that the department was working on a lot of ways to remove the roadblock of getting the special education endorsement. And that's been in place for a while. I think there's 3 different avenues teachers can take to get a special education endorsement for free. And over the summer, we were kind of at the ARC looking into whether or not that was actually being taken advantage of, and if it's not necessarily the endorsement that's the roadblock, or if it's just teacher pay or workload or things like that. So I think teacher pay definitely needs to be a part of the conversation. I know there's something going around right now that a district in Texas is offering starting teachers to come with bonuses, work for them starting at $69,000 a year because of the teacher shortage. And I've seen so many Tennessee teachers share that and say, hey, maybe I should move to Texas. So it's kind of just something that should always really be high priority on the table. So I just wanted to throw that in there while we were talking about endorsement.
No, great point. Thanks, Jennifer. Anyone else before we move on have anything to add? I know that's a lot, Ginger. I'll give you a second to catch a breath as you're documenting it, but all good feedback. And I think it's really unique. Most of the feedback that we all just shared was around gifted students. So there's obviously an itch there that people are trying to scratch that they feel like has not been acknowledged. So thank you for bringing that forward in this meeting where we can get that documented pretty quickly and be able to share that with DOE leadership and other stakeholders to make sure they know, what's going on in the world of gifted education as well as students with disabilities. So really good feedback there. I think, Ginger, I don't know if you need to move ahead in a slide to move on to today's discussion, but I want to kind of talk a little bit, just some of the takeaways just briefly that we did from the first meeting. We don't want to lose any of that momentum. So obviously things that were discussed there, most of it, frankly, was just introductions, and we could all see each other and really understand the lanes that we were kind of in right now and where we were coming from, get a better understanding of what everybody did. As Ginger and I were starting to talk last week, one of the things, unfortunately, that we'll really have to start accelerating is creating kind of a whiteboard for us to throw out ideas about areas that I think we want to see some funding. And a reminder, and she just pulled it up. She must have read my mind. Was we really are going to break it kind of into three buckets of a must-have, a should-have, and a nice-to-have. And then even a long shot is just, hey, it'd be awesome. To your point, I think you kind of just said it there, Jennifer. If we could bump teacher pay up to 60 grand a year, that'd be awesome. Maybe that's a long shot. Maybe that's a nice to have. I don't know, but we can work through it. But what we wanted to do was start the process today of allowing us maybe to share, for the next 20 minutes or something, kind of where each one of us were seeing real priorities that we individually identified as must-haves or should-haves or nice-to-haves, or if there was a theme that starts to emerge from this group about, 80% of us think this is a must-have, because it seems like we've got time to have these conversations. We really don't, because it's going to be a quick turnaround into January before Representative Whitson and others are in the legislature are going to be involved in, other budgets and things like that. So we want to make sure that we give something that's tangible and that's a good director for the DOE team and for others. So I think what we'll do is maybe open that up if there are folks that have, in the last 10 days thought about a must-have, a nice-to-have, a should-have, and maybe let Ginger kind of document that. And even if you have to do it in chat or just applaud or whatever, using those little icons in chat, to say, hey, that's a must-have for me too. I think it will help us really start to frame some of these ideas around, we're starting to see a theme emerge here about what all of us, whether we're from the gifted community, the state, the private sector, whatever, are really starting to see needs for children. And this is something that we all believe in. So I'll kind of stop right there. Ginger, do you want to add any color to that language or anything that might be needed from the DOE perspective before we kind of dive in on what we're looking at as must-have, should-haves, and maybe nice-to-haves?
No, I think you framed that up nicely. So thank you for doing that. As far as like me capturing this part of the conversation, I'll listen to the different things that you all are sharing, try to capture as much of that as I can as we go through it. And then we can circle back at the end and really solidify that as, is this just our brainstorming list that we'll come back to next time to really refine into formal recommendations? Or are there things from this conversation that you all want to go ahead and surface into a formal recommendation that we would submit this time? Formal does not mean that it can't change during the next conversation, but I just want to make sure that what I'm sharing back after this meeting is accurate to the conversation that you all have. So we'll revisit that at the end, but if I pause you all at some point to get clarification, just know that's where it's coming from. So I want to make sure that I'm representing what you're sharing accurately.
Yeah, that's perfect. And before we move to, I know there's already folks raising their hand. I think one of the things too that I want to make sure that I kind of challenge all of us on is not just wait till the 2 weeks till that day to come up with our must-haves, nice-to-haves, and all that. As we create a list today, I think I can lean on Ginger. Obviously, Thanksgiving coming up. Maybe Ginger, we can put it together and send it back out to folks to let them maybe come back with their top 5, top 3. We might come out of this with 30 different ideas, which would make it really challenging, but also, something we need to look at too. So as we're going through that, kind of think about, where you are and where you might hear other people comment. And let's see if we can get a list today. And then as we're going through the next 10, 12 days, start really zeroing in on that right before Christmas, because then we'll be in January, as all of us know. So, Ann, I think your hand was raised first. So we'll start with you, and then Wendy, you'll be right after Anna.
Sure. I'm Anna. Just as a reminder, since I was here in this meeting a little bit late, and I'm a parent of a child who's twice exceptional, gifted in dyslexia. And I think on my must-have is, we know for 7 years we've had the state dyslexia law that Lori, who's in this group, worked so hard on. And those kids are traveling through our RTI, but there's no funding that goes with that. So our schools are left up to try to patch together some work for these children in RTI. And a lot of our kids who struggle and families who struggle to get IEPs actually could be very well served there, and could take some load off of some of our S teams, et cetera. So I think that that is very much a need. I know I've talked to Penny Schwinn about it, and dyslexia with our Tennessee Dyslexia Advisory Council. That is absolutely a must-have for that group of students. And then my second must-have goes around those children who are twice exceptional. Twice exceptional is gifted and learning disabled, gifted with autism, gifted with another disability. And I think we really need to beef up what we are looking at for those students identification-wise, because they're harder to see. And IEP teams tend to just look at them for their disability. And we know very clearly from the research that we need to, with twice exceptional kids, we have to look at both the exceptionalities on both ends of the spectrum, and that can be hard. And on our 2018 gifted manual from the Department of Education, they are specifically called out. But teams don't know how to do that. So there needs to be some training around this piece, because I think so many of our students with disabilities live on the lower end of their IEPs where people make assumptions about them. So we really need to do a better job to be charged to find those twice exceptional students as well.
Oh, great feedback. Thank you. Wendy?
Yeah, I mean, I have more of a question, and then I'm happy to fill in some must-haves. And it could just be me easily, but I'm struggling with this structure. I mean, are we saying that we're going to continue with a resource-based formula, and so we're just trying to figure out the resources? Because I can think of my oldest child, and her must-haves include speech, OT, PT, vision, like all of those things that are in her IEP. And then I can think of I can think of another child whose must-haves. And so it's so IEP driven that I don't know how to put this in the funding formula.
Yeah, it's a great point. I actually thought about that before the meeting, because the challenge, I mean, even me, if I take this hat off and put the dad hat on, my first instinct is my must-haves, whatever's best for Kinsley. And it might not be good for you guys, but and I think that's the real challenge that I think we're trying to navigate through this, Wendy, is if we're looking at it from an enterprise-wide level, like, Jennifer kind of touched on it. I think one of the areas that might end up being a must-have for us is we encourage better pay for gifted teachers and special education teachers, but that's also a universal messaging that's probably going to come from 15 other committees too. And so I think it's unique. Sometimes it's hard for us to take the parent hat off and not identify that. But if you don't bring it up, then there might be 8 other people in here that are agreeing on the same thing to say that's a must-have for me too. So my recommendation, unless Ginger comes back and says that's not what we want at all, was for us to get it out there both on an individual level from what you see, but also understand that we will have to kind of combine that into, is there an enterprise wide demand for that request? So a must-have for me might be, like you just said, visual or speech, that, more than one speech opportunity per week. And all we can do is kind of bring that together and present it and understand that there's going to be 150 other needs too. So I certainly don't want to stop us from not bringing anything up, just understanding that if we do bring 55 different things up, not all of them are going to be able to fall under that must-have that we're going to be able to advocate for. So I hope that maybe clarifies it a little bit, Wendy, that I would bring up what you think you need to bring up and on your heart. And maybe that ties into what other folks are going to say. That's a must-have for me too.
Okay, then I would say, because I think just legally, the must-haves for each child are what the IEP team puts in the IEP.
Yeah.
And so I would structure my answer on this is, I'll put it as a should have. I'll aim a little lower than maybe I want to. I think we should have a formula that is based on the needs of the specific children, whether it is based on, service hours, or I don't recommend placement, but whatever. If we divide, in different states, they do it different ways, where you divide higher needs disability categories, but whatever it is, I think our formula should reflect the needs of the students, as opposed to us just listing things that IEP teams, if my IEP team says this is needed for FAPE for my kid, you got to give it whether it's on this list or not. So that's how I'm going to structure my answer.
Well, and I think maybe I want to make sure I understand you, because I think you're going to key in on what all of us are hoping from this, is that funding is based on their need and not just a number. And so maybe there's a way to build the BEP, or, I hate to say BEP, but the new funding model that DOE and the legislature will work on is there's going to be dollars that are going to be devoted to the students that might need a little bit more, and maybe some students that don't need as much. Maybe they get, you know, what fits them. And I think that is critical in this conversation of what your takeaway is I know they need this, but really what they need is the funds that are around that to be able to get those services too. And Ginger, maybe that's something we tie in there. You know, the dollars stay with the student, or that there's continual evaluation about student needs, and not just always a number thrown out there and thinking, well, if we give them 15 grand a student this year, they'll need that in 5 years too. That's not true. Is that fair? Wendy, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Wendy, but I think you're onto something that would be critical for all of us.
Yes, I think the way that, you know, and there are states that do it, it's student-based funding that is based on, you know, and it's some rough assessment, and different places do it in different ways, but based on roughly on the needs of the individual students. That's what I would say.
No, great point. Thank you. So we'll go to Jennifer and then Director Smith after Jennifer. Jennifer.
I was very similar to what Wendy was just mentioning. I was going to say maybe as a group, we should kind of just agree that the baseline of must have is anything legally required, like it says in the description there, that we kind of all understand that's absolute, and anything IDEA required is part of it. And then the should haves would be a little bit more flexible. But I wish we had more information about still like what other states are doing that's really working for this subgroup, both the gifted students and the special ed students. And because pretty much everything Wendy said, like I feel like there's going to have to be a lot of flexibility and ratios and whatnot. Like I don't understand the complexities of BEP fully, and I try to be pretty well versed on these kinds of things related to education. So it's obviously very complicated, but I think we all know that the students should have maybe like a cap on, or the teachers. See, I keep focusing on the teachers, but the teachers should have maybe a cap on how many students they're serving, so that that's a part of this formula, whether it's a ratio of funding per student to make it so that they don't have to have as many on their caseload and you can hire more teachers. I don't know. But I think important should have.
Well, that's a good point. And I mean, maybe it's something just as simple as, hey, one of the important things is simplify the BEP process so parents understand exactly what their student would be eligible for, the dollars that are spent towards students, and not this rocket science, you know, type formula that, to your point, that a lot of folks that are learning about this still have a hard time saying, how in the world, you know, how does that funding look? Director Smith.
Hey, thanks, Brad. I wanted to go back to what Wendy said, because I think she makes a really good point and hits on one of the challenges here for all of us. We're so used to the BEP funding formula, and that's a resource-based formula. And the way I understand it, and Ginger, I don't want to speak for the Department of Education or Commissioner Schwinn or the governor, but I think the concept here is that we are at least exploring moving away from a resource-based model to one that would be more student-based. And so the way that I've tried to think about this is we need to identify those costs that are additional to kind of your base funding amount, because every student's going to have a base amount, and regardless of the category of student that you are, that base amount is going to be there. And then for this group of students, we need to think about what are those additional costs that are tied to students with disabilities. And then we got to think about what are those things and what are the costs that are attached to those things. And then we got to come up with a dollar amount to add on to the base amount. And that's a really difficult thing to do. But I think that is our charge.
Good stuff, Stephen. Thank you, Lori. And then back to Leanne.
Thank you. I have just two comments. The first is, I hear when we're talking about funding, I think it's important for us to think about, and I don't know how we incorporate this into a formula or anything like that, but for example, my daughter, if she had been properly educated in first, second, and third grade, while she might have been an expensive student in first, second, and third grade, she would be pretty much self-sufficient now as a sophomore in high school. But because I fought for 4 or 5 years and she got no intervention, then she became a very expensive student for 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th. You know, the earlier we do the right things, the less expensive overall the education process becomes, especially when we're talking with students with disabilities that have a known intervention like dyslexia. So, I know that when we talk about, legislation and the costs, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. While we may have to start now doing the right thing at all grades, if we do the right things at kindergarten, first, second, third, you're going to find that those kids are going to be less expensive to educate long term because of that. So I just think it's important to keep that, in terms of when we're communicating with legislators about the budget and the funds. I always hear them say things like, we just always want more money. Well, no, I want more money to do the right thing so that we don't need more money long term, if that makes sense. The other thing I would point out as a must-have, and I know that the Department of Education routinely says that they won't dictate an intervention to a district, but if you say, for example, the must-have is the appropriate intervention for a dyslexic student, you've got a bunch of Yahoo districts out there who pull whatever cheap, low training, whatever they can get to meet the requirement, even though it doesn't help the students. And then they come back to parents and to the Department of Education and they say, well, we're using a dyslexic specific intervention. Well, they're using something they found on the internet that they could get inexpensively and train in a half a day. There has to be, in my mind, from a must-have, there has to be more than just guidance on what they should use. There has to be, hey, these are proven interventions that work with students with this specific disability, and this is what we expect you. We expect you to use something like this that's proven and not something that you can randomly find and afford. And, in my district, we have people being trained to work with dyslexics in a half a day. And we all know that they're not effective. However, we can make that, I know that doesn't have anything to do with funding, but it is a critical part, because otherwise these districts take their funding and they spend it on frivolous stuff that won't help our kids and tell us that they're helping our kids. And we don't get any further down the road, which is part of the struggle we have in my community now. So.
No, that's good feedback. I had to go speak to a group in Murfreesboro a few weeks ago, and I'll pivot back really quickly. But I think, Lori, it's touching on what you just mentioned. We were having conversations about individuals with disabilities and employment, just different things. Point being, what I shared with them is I said, everybody says they're ADA compliant, but what they mean is I'm doing the minimum. So why is that not good enough? And I think that's what you're getting at is, we got to be able to do better for these students and not just say, I'm training folks to work with students with dyslexia in 6 hours, but you should be happy with that because I trained somebody, and that wouldn't work for any other student, but for ours, gifted or those with disabilities, I think there's an expectation there is, why can't you guys just be happy? Like, why isn't that good enough? But anyway, I'm not going to get going on that. You guys don't need to hear from me. Leanne, you're up, and then Anna, we'll go back to you.
That sounded like a great sermon, Brad. You can just keep on preaching.
Sorry, yeah,
I added my must-haves in the chat earlier, so they're there for the record. But I wanted to throw out, we need to keep in mind, Tennessee recognizes a couple of disability areas that are not included in federal legislation, functionally delayed and giftedness.
Yeah.
So other special education labels are going to get some federal money to serve them. Functionally delayed and gifted are not. So if federal money is used to buy a table and chairs for a resource classroom, a gifted student can't sit in those table and chairs. A functionally delayed student could not sit in those table and chairs because it's all about the money. So when we're funding, let's remember there are some students out there that aren't getting any federal money in case we need to play that, put that into play.
Yeah, no, great point. And one of the things too, Ginger, I'm going to talk to Ginger about, and I think Lori, you just touched on it, and I'm trying not to be selfish here, but I really do believe it. That's a big reason we're looking at Tennessee Early Intervention and how we invest in that, because if you pay for something now to create opportunities for a student by the time they're in third grade, you might not have to fund it at the level because you met that need on the early. And I think that's what you were getting at with your own personal experience with your daughters. If somebody just met the need at 8 years old, they're not having to pay twice as much at 16. And I think that's a fair point to bring up, is there funding opportunities for early intervention and for other programs that might allow us to really allow the student to meet their need and be exceptional at whatever level that is, earlier than what we historically have been doing, or in some cases not even doing at all. And I think that's kind of what you were getting at there. Anna, so your hand's raised.
Just really quickly, to capture some of the other things people have said, I really feel like what Lori said about that teacher training piece. Micro-credentialing was mentioned a second ago. I think we have to realize in this funding model that our kids are spending most time with gen ed teachers, and our gen ed teachers tend not to know anything about disability. So I think one of the things that I would like to have would be more gen ed teacher training, because they're spending so much time there, but our gen ed teachers tend to only have knowledge that is really myth-based about a whole lot of disabilities. And so I think that teacher training and gen ed would help a lot of the services just to know what to do, how to effectively accommodate in those classrooms. I think that is very much needed, because I think that's where a lot of parents are really struggling when they're out of their special ed setting about a lot of the barriers those kids are facing in the gen ed classroom. So I would like to add general education teacher training to a list of things that would be nice to have.
No, great point. And a good feedback. Thank you. Any other, not to pivot negatively away from that, but I know there was a lot of conversation around gifted. Are there any other conversations around special education or any of those things that we want to make sure we get down to Ginger? We've got probably about 4 or 5 minutes. I didn't realize we were flying by today, and I want to leave a little time at the end to kind of wrap up. But are there any other comments that you guys want to make? Carol, I see your hands raised. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I just think sort of going back to things that were mentioned early on. I mean, I do think that, as Dr. Martin was saying, making sure that we have adequate paraprofessionals in classrooms where they're needed, and recognizing that is a cost for some students, and to weigh that in, I think is important. And I guess for me, would be to have a nurse in every school. Because 1 for 3,000 students just isn't enough for kids with disabilities. So.
Yeah, and especially, I don't know how they do it, Carol, you might know, or Ginger might even know, if those nurses have to split time between schools. When our students have an episode, that can be life or death, and that's not hyperbole. So very good point. Yeah,
and that's exactly right. And they do share a nurse across a number of schools. A nurse might be an hour away. And, when you think about children with epilepsy, for example, and a seizure can be life-threatening. If you think about, other kinds of things that happen where an injection is an immediate savior. A nurse is important. Thanks.
No, great point. Ginger, one of the other things that I was thinking about that had been shared with me too, maybe as a nice to have or something down the road, is we're also raising our future adults with how they treat people with disabilities, with students that are already in the classroom. Maybe there's opportunities for us to work on program deliveries for traditional students and allow them to partner more with students that are gifted or with disabilities around. I hate saying buddy system as if it's you're putting a pecking order, but just more engagement like that. I know they're in general education classrooms, but really getting a better understanding about our community might create future leaders in the disability movement too. So all good feedback there. We've got about a minute. If there's anybody else, I certainly don't want to cut anybody off, because I know Ginger's typing furiously over there and I want to give her a chance to actually breathe. But are there any other comments or areas that you want to look at? And again, as Ginger said, this doesn't stop the idea to be able to submit something next week. Like we're not doing it that way. just want to make sure we get a pretty good baseline for us to keep the discussions moving forward. Anna, go ahead.
I'm just building on something you said a second ago. I think kind of that education piece. I think we also really need to do a better job of talking about what disabilities look like. I think even in your sentence, talking about a buddy system. I mean, some of the kids with disabilities are playing soccer. They're in honors classrooms. They're doing all the things, but they still have disabilities. So I think we just do need a lot of education with peers just around what diabetes is, what it looks like, and how people are living amongst us as children in school with different disabilities, and how to be accepting and not shaming around that.
That's it. Yeah.
Because I think so many hidden disabilities are really hard for kids to understand. And I know my own daughter, who has epilepsy, celiac disease, and dyslexia and giftedness, she feels like a conundrum, and she feels pretty misunderstood. And that can really lead to some of that shame and some of those harder outcomes of suicidality and depression and anxiety as these kids age. So I love that idea about creating a safer space with peers.
Yeah, it's just the idea, you sometimes you fear what you don't understand, right? And it creates a natural discrimination there, even by accident. To your point, our children play sports, and what happens if they have a seizure, and what happens, I mean, then they go just down this whole litany of, why it's not good, or why it would be bad to do this and all that. And I think we can help keep creating a culture of more inclusion. I think that's a good thing across school districts, and even creating opportunities for, for program delivery, for credit, if they're working with students that are in gifted programs or disabilities and they want to go to college, they'd be a teacher, and that's, a credit that gets accepted. Because I don't know, it's not my lane, Ginger, but just trying to think out loud to be, where we feel like we've kind of laid everything on the table to share with DOE. So let me make sure I'm not missing anything in the chat. A lot of really good comments in the chat. And then Leanne, you said a good one too, support and training for parents. It's a lonely world that we live in. And I think there are friends that we have that want to understand, they just can't. And I think that's the hard part for us sometimes, just say you're never going to understand. But good point about support and training for parents. And maybe that creates a stronger community around supporting our students as well. So really, really good feedback. As Ginger said, obviously these meetings are recorded, so we'll be able to go back in the chat and catch up on these too, and not lose sight of any of these things. So we got about 8 minutes. Ginger, do you want to wrap up with anything around things that you might need for us before the next meeting, and then kind of talk about maybe what we're going to do in 2 weeks as we head into December?
Yes. So our next meeting is December 7th, I think. Yes, make sure I didn't get you guys confused with the next group. So December 7th at 1:30 Central. We will get materials loaded into your Google Drive, so you'll have access to that ahead of time, be able to look at what our discussion questions will be for that. During that meeting, we'll continue this discussion and really try to move to that place of what are those things that you definitely want to put forward as kind of a more formal recommendations for those areas. So more refining really between this meeting and the next meeting. You're continuing to have those conversations with stakeholders, trying to gather more feedback from them. I'll share a list. I'll refine this list, pull some more things over from the chat, share that back with you guys, so you can then take that to your stakeholder communities and have conversation around the things that you brought up today, and then also around what else. So are the things that you all brought up today, are those hitting home with people? And then are there other things that people would like to see added to that list that will help us, refine that and really bucket these to have the strongest list that you all would want to put forth coming out of that next meeting. There are, I think we talked about this last time, but if I'm getting you guys confused with the other group, I apologize. They all run together after a while on some of the logistics pieces, but there is a toolkit located in the bigger Google Drive that's linked in your invitation. So if you need any resources for talking points, social media, comments, things like that to help gather additional feedback, please use that toolkit. There's one in there for subcommittee members that you can use to help kind of get the word out that you're there. If people want to share feedback with you specific to your subcommittee focus or just in general. In addition, there's also some graphics in there to kind of help people understand what we're talking about when we think about school funding and that student focused funding that we're really focused on here in this group. And so your charge is really continue having conversations with stakeholders, continue to think through your own thoughts on that. You might also consider leveraging the town hall recordings that are on our website as well to see what you're hearing from different communities across the state that might add to the thoughts you're already having around the students with disabilities and gifted students, and what you're hearing there as the needs that we might want to consider for the funding formula. Oh, Brad, you're muted.
It's been a while since I've done that. That's God's way of humbling me, where I'm just yapping. It's just like Charlie Brown's teacher. Thank you for telling me that, though. What I was saying was, I think the challenge, kind of the takeaway for all of us is make sure we review this meeting again before we come to the next one, so we really do have a good framework about what we want to do as far as prioritizing that, because it really is hard to believe. I think we've got it on the 7th, then another one on the 21st, and then I think the legislature's back the next time we meet, or pretty darn close to that. So our clock is kind of ticking, and make sure you share that. I know social media, Department of Education has been really active promoting the town halls and what we're doing here. And Ginger, I want to thank you. You've done a great job helping to moderate this and take notes. I know it's a lot on your plate, but it's not lost on me, your investment in this conversation. So thank you for what you're doing. And then there's others. I see Anna is typing in the chat that are providing information around dyslexia and county information for us to be able to pull. Just make sure we do that. Make sure we come back and we're ready to start kind of going through that must have, nice to have, and kind of long shot deals. And we'll keep plugging away. So Ginger, anything else before we wrap up?
Nope, I think that's it.
All right. Well, I hope everybody has a great Thanksgiving. You guys count your blessings, take some time off, recharge your batteries, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye all.